Hole in the Rock, a primeval slash in the towering cliffs which border the Colorado River in southeastern Utah. It was primarily created by nature in the lost ages of time when the Colorado River was cutting the greatest canyons in the world. But over 80 years ago, man also wrote his chapter here. With blasting powder, ropes, guy wires, cordwood, and an indomitable will that never knew defeat, they built a sort of shoot-the-chute road down which they took an entire train of 83 wagons, 250 people, and a large herd of cattle. When they reached this spot, they had traveled 65 miles from Escalante, their starting point. Once down this passageway where even a man on foot now has trouble, once to the river and across it, their journey was far from over. In fact, it was almost only beginning, for ahead lay about 135 miles, twice the distance they'd already come, over some of the most rugged, primitive country in the world. Navajo slick rock, which offered no footing for man or beast, slashed by impassable chasms which must be wearily followed for miles to find a crossing. This was the country they faced after their trial of blood and toil and heroism, which took them down Hole in the Rock. This was the country they crossed with a wagon train, a total of 200 heartbreaking miles from start to finish before they reached the end of their journey of destiny. Early in the summer of 1879, they sent an exploring party to find a route to Montezuma here on the San Juan River, where it was the plan to establish a colony. The 8-wagon exploring party started from Panguitch and took this southern route, crossing the Colorado at Lee's Ferry and traveling to Montezuma via this route. Water was very scarce, not enough for a larger train, and Indians, although none forced them to fight, were extremely hostile. They made it to Montezuma in about 6 weeks. They returned via this northern route, crossing the Colorado at Moab, and traveling up through Green River and Castledale, circling back to Panguitch from the north. This way was long, about 400 miles, but passable, and took not much more than 6 weeks. But someone got the idea for a shortcut, which turned out to be the longest, most difficult shortcut in history. Although warned by some, they took the too optimistic advice of others and chose the route. It took them nearly 6 months, into and through an entire winter. Their journey, while unequal for heroism, was in many ways a serious blunder. Who was responsible? Today, it is impossible to pinpoint blame, but their epic courage remains a bright page in history for all to read. The Mormons used this road, if you can call it that, including the Hole in the Rock passageway, for at least a year as a supply route to the new settlement of Bluff they established at their journey's end. After about a year, it was abandoned in favor of a longer but more passable route. And from that day until 1961, no wheeled vehicle ever passed completely over it again. Historians and modern-day adventurers traveled it, always at least some of it on foot or horseback. Some parties took jeeps over parts of it. But it remained for the Tote Gote, a vehicle which has proven it can go wherever wagons could, in many places they could not, to put wheel tracks down Hole in the Rock again over 3/4 of a century later, and travel the entire distance of the old Mormon pioneer road. Some of it was in trucks along passable roads since constructed by the state and uranium miners, but about 65 miles of it was over country still as rugged and primitive as when the pioneers crossed it. We started from Escalante, the gathering point of that wagon train which first rolled out in late October 1879. We started with automobiles and a pickup truck, hauling our tote goats over a good dirt road. It was a far different beginning than that the wagon train faced, but before we were through, we'd faced country still as rough and impassable as when the wagons labored over it. This is the country between Escalante and Hole in the Rock. You can drive a car almost to the hole from Escalante now, but it took those Mormon pioneers over a month, from late October to well into December of 1879. They reached it in the dead of winter. Dance Hall Rock, about 40 miles from Escalante, was a major camp for the pioneer wagon train. This is the Tote Gote, the mule of the mountains in the vehicle world, powered and balanced to go almost anywhere. Before our trip was over, we'd taken it, including the places we lifted it by hand, up, over, and down country where a mule could not go. Dance Hall Rock was one of the few bright spots in that entire exhausting journey over 80 years ago. The early Mormons were noted for their love of dancing, and here in one of the most God-forsaken spots on earth, they found a smooth spot and square danced to the music of 3 old-time fiddlers who were in the wagon train and put Dance Hall Rock on the map. A member of our party and his guitar serves in place of the fiddlers. Slickers aren't the usual garb. It was raining heavily during our square dance scene. All them on left, and away we go. On from Dance Hall Rock, we continued toward Hole in the Rock. Just before nightfall of our second day out, we unloaded the Tote Gotes, where the truck road ended. Before camping for the night, we rode over for a look at Hole in the Rock. This was the sight that greeted us. It taxes the imagination even to dream of getting wagons down there. But those Mormon pioneers built a road of sorts through that slot and did it. A plaque was riveted into the rock many years later by descendants of those pioneers to commemorate their feat. Mormon pioneers of the San Juan Valley crossed the Colorado River at Hole in the Rock January 26, 1880. 26 wagons were lowered over the cliff that day. A total of 250 persons were in the party. All made the perilous descent and ferried the river here. It telescopes into less than 50 words the story of a month and a half of road building down the hole and days of hairbreadth adventure, literally shooting wagons down this narrow slit to the river below. 26 wagons went down that first day. The rest, from a second group camped a few miles back from the hole, came later. We made camp that night near the top of Hole in the Rock. Our party included the drivers of our truck and cars, and some just along for the ride. We would thin down to 6 Tote Gote riders the next day. The next morning, we were ready to shoot the hole. Meet the members of our expedition. Elmer Purtyman, Justice of the Peace and outdoorsman of Sedonia, Arizona. Bud, his brother, who furnished the comic relief for the trip. Eugene Conrado, California, editor of Desert Magazine. Bill Berry of Provo, Utah, leader of the trek. Curtis Vick, a close friend of Conrado. Bill Kimball of Phoenix, Arizona. We started down the Hole in the Rock, gear packed, tote goats full of gas, and a spare can in our duffel. We were thankful we had only tote goats that weighed 115 pounds each instead of loaded wagons. Some 65 miles later of actual travel on the goats over some of the roughest country on earth, we had used only about 2 gallons per vehicle. As we entered the hole, we were at the point where those Mormon pioneers in 1879 still had nearly 4 months of back-breaking work and hardship ahead of them, much of it in the dead of winter. They were a month and a half building a road down the hole and to the river, if you could call it a road. It was a giant chute-to-chute for part of the way, and a shaky shelf tacked onto a sheer cliff for a short distance before they neared the river. We put ropes on the rear of our tote goats to hold them back, just like the pioneers did their wagons, but we didn't rough lock the rear wheels like they had to. The actual descent. You see only a few minutes on film, but it took us all day. And this was where they took wagons down, and even back up during the year it was used as a supply route to the settlement of Bluff. The huge boulders which block the hole have fallen in since the pioneers built the road. Also, erosion has taken out several feet of fill, which made it higher up in the slot than it is here. Pioneer accounts tell of how the wagons would be rough-locked by chaining the rear wheels fast. As many men as possible would hang back on the ropes, and away they would go. Many an animal was dragged. A lot of blood and hide from both men and beasts were left on the rocks. But not one wagon was damaged beyond repair, and there were no serious injuries. The pioneers were a month and a half building the road down through the hole and literally tacking on a portion to a cliff by blasting holes, sticking in horizontal posts, and filling with brush and dirt up to the level, or a crevice in the rock chipped out for the inside wagon wheels. Which now blocks the trail, undoubtedly fell in after the road was discontinued. That stretch along a sheer cliff in the background is where they bored holes for their horizontal posts on which to pile fill up for the outside wheels, literally tacking on a road to the side of the cliff until they were past this point. Steps were not cut by the members of the wagon train. They were hacked out some 20 years later by a party establishing a trading post down by the river, later abandoned. From here on down, it was fairly easy going. We rode the goats instead of lugging them. the end of our third day. The same journey had taken those Mormon pioneers 3 months from their starting point of Escalante into country that had never seen a wagon track before. Here we met our boatman, Gay Staveley of Mexican Hat, who had come from Height upstream. He took us across in 4 trips. The Mormons built a ferry and took their 83 wagons across at the same spot, swimming the large herd of cattle that accompanied the train. The river here is about 200 yards wide. One pioneer account tells of oxen that panicked, knocking a man off the ferry into the river on one of the trips. He swam safely to shore. This slope coming out of the river is steeper than it looks and mushy with loose dirt. Full power on the Tote Gote still requires a push to make it. We camped across the Colorado our third night. We were a tired bunch and looked it. That leaping fire is a modern touch, aided by a little gasoline from our reserve supply. It both felt good and provided enough light to take these pictures. The next morning, our boatman leaves us. He will go downriver about 50 miles before finding a spot where he can get his boat out of the water. From here, for the first time, we were on our own. No truck to take us back, no boatman. We would travel much of the way navigating by compass and following the old wagon road wherever we could trace it. We found old stretching boards of trappers, remnants of an era when prospectors, stockmen, and trappers roamed this area for years after the wagon train. How old, no one could guess. There is inscription rock to the right, where many of the wagon train inscribed their names and dates as they passed. Indian ruins were spotted by Bud Purdyman. Finding old Indian ruins of the Southwest is his hobby, and he's an expert on them. The Indians of this civilization vanished about 700 years ago. We could estimate the age of these pottery fragments easier than we could the trappers' boards. A stop for lunch on our fourth day found us well into the country beyond the hole. The pilot of this plane had previously agreed to fly over us and drop some fresh meat. He didn't see us the first time over, and we resumed our journey thinking he'd missed us completely. The plane came back and spotted us. We were going to get our fresh meat after all. The first drop proved a little disappointing. The note said, 6 dehydrated steaks for 6 dehydrated Tote Goters. They dropped us 6 steel ball bearings. The next drop was more satisfying. Fresh ham was a welcome relief from 3 days eating out of cans. The next day, we began to encounter a taste of what was to come: steep slopes and slick rock. The Tote Gotes were taking it in stride. Those pioneer wagons just didn't have the gear ratio of our goats. Here's part of the old wagon road and the rock work that had to be laid to provide a road wide enough for wagons. We paused for a rest at the top of that pole and filled our canteens. These water holes proved the salvation of the wagon train, and us, and anyone else traveling in that country. The slick rock country doesn't absorb a drop in a rainstorm. It all runs somewhere, including these potholes where it's caught and held. We reached the top of Gray Mesa and stopped to check our maps. Bill Berry, the leader and navigator, checks his compass. A road built by uranium miners during the uranium boom following World War II doesn't last for long on the route we want to follow. It was on Gray Mesa, in a howling blizzard which a covered wagon failed to keep out, a baby boy was born to Mons and Olivia Larson on February 21st, 1880. Said the Pioneer Journal, which recorded the event, he grew to be a fine, stalwart man and reared a fine family. This view of some of the country we encountered was best described in a letter by Elizabeth Decker in 1880 when she wrote, "The mountains are just one solid rock, as smooth as an apple." fifth night in a cave, small but welcome because the heavens certainly opened up. Rain poured down most of the night. Those staples of the trail, hot cakes and coffee, tasted doubly good the next morning after a wet and miserable night. The next day at Clay Hill Pass, another landmark on the Pioneer Road. Comb Wash. That ridge to the right is Comb Ridge, which the pioneers named and could find no way through it. They had to follow the wash 10 weary miles until they reached the San Juan River and could go around the end of the ridge. In the distance is the San Juan River, which runs on down into the Colorado River below Hole in the Rock. The pioneers had to climb up San Juan Hill from the river because they found the riverbed too closely walled in by cliffs to follow it. It was the last climb of the journey and one of the toughest of the entire route. Pioneer accounts state 7 teams were hooked to one wagon to make it, and the exhausted horses left a trail of blood from collars and knees as they lurched and scrambled up the steep rocky slope. Years later, whenever one member of the expedition recalled San Juan Hill, his son records that he would weep at the recollection of the suffering animals. As we rode down into the flats, we could see Bluff, named by the pioneers after they reached it on April 6, 1880, where they ended their journey. They were heading for Montezuma, 18 miles farther up the river, where the earlier exploring party had decided the settlement should be made. But when they came to open country on the river, which gave promise of a fairly good place to settle, they just ran out of steam. They were too tired to go further, and here they stayed. Sunbonnet Rock at Bluff, where the National Society of Sons of Utah Pioneers placed a plaque in memory of the settlement and end of the journey. One sentence in it is perhaps one of the greatest understatements ever made. No pioneering band ever overcame greater difficulties in establishing and maintaining a home. Even after they arrived, their troubles were not over. They fought the flooding San Juan River and hostile Indians for years before both were subdued. A journey that was to take the wagon train 6 weeks had taken nearly 6 months. We had taken 7 days, mostly a gay adventure. Of that 200-mile trail, our Tote Gotes, on about 2 gallons of gasoline per machine, had negotiated some 65 miles, which today are still unmapped, trackless, and impassable for any vehicle but the ones we rode. No metal plaque on a rock can tell the story of that wagon train of more than 80 years ago. Even we couldn't, after coming over the trail they'd blazed. But we could read it, mile after impassable mile, where they'd carved out an American epic.